They came to celebrate the club's promotion to the second division for the first time in 50 years, and now they're running for their lives.
It was supposed to be a day of celebration, but turned into one of absolute horror. 40 years ago this week, a fire tore through Bradford City's stadium on the final day of the season, killing 56 fans. What caused it, and how did it change football forever? I'm Lucy Watson, and this is What You Need to Know. Well, joining me from Leeds is Chris Dawkes, who is sports correspondent at ITV News Calendar, who's made a special series of documentaries about the fire and its aftermath. And the series is called Never Forget the Bradford City Stadium Fire. And Chris, thanks so much for chatting to me. And no doubt you have spent months and months speaking to people about what happened all those years ago. Now, I'm from the Northwest, you're from Yorkshire, and I can vividly remember, I'm also a Liverpool fan, you're not a Bradford fan, you're a Leeds fan, but I can vividly remember the day that Hillsborough happened. I can remember being in church with my granny and the priest saying, you know, let us take a moment. And it quietened the whole church because the disaster was unfolding at that very moment, that Saturday evening. What can you recall of that day, of that time, of first knowing about it, Chris?
Yeah, hi Lucy. I too remember Hillsborough vividly. I was 7 years old then, but I was only 3 actually for the Bradford City fire in 1985. I think there's a collective feeling around this area that they don't really talk about Bradford. Even here in Bradford, in the Bradford area, there's a stoicism, which I'm sure you'll be familiar with doing stories up in Yorkshire, that they'll never forget what happened on the 11th of May 1985, but they don't particularly like to talk about it. And so growing up for me, I grew up in Pudsey, which is between Leeds and Bradford, about 5 miles from Valley Parade. I didn't know that much about the Bradford City fire until I started working at Calendar, really. I knew that it happened. I knew there was this disaster in Bradford in 1985 and people tragically lost their lives. But not the detail, why it happened, how it happened, when it happened. I remember my dad, who was an English teacher in Bradford, in the Bradford area, in the 80s, 90s, 2000s. He told me once that he worked with a couple of young men who were at the fire that day in 1985, and they were on the opposite side, the Midland Road stand, as opposed to the main stand where the fire actually happened. And they said to him that we got home that night, and our legs, we had round marks on our legs, burn marks, where they had coins in their pockets. And the heat was so intense that the coins had been heated up from the other side of the ground and actually burnt their legs. And it's things like that that stick with you.
And this was a day, wasn't it, Chris, that was absolute joy that turns into total disaster. What sort? You know, if you were a Bradford City fan, what kind of emotions, what were you expecting out of that day?
I mean, this was a huge day. They hadn't played in the second division, or the top 2 divisions, I should say, since before the Second World War. They hadn't won a league title.
Because they were promoted, weren't they? They were Division 3, promoted to Division 2. That's what, and this was the last game of the season, am I right?
That's right, yeah. They'd won the third division title, their first league title in 56 years. And what they'd done that season is that Trevor Cherry, who was the manager, and Terry Yorath, they'd fostered this great team spirit. They'd managed to get together this really young, hungry squad. And by Christmas that season, 84-85, they went top of the table, and they stayed there throughout the year. And then they won promotion at Cambridge, and then they went and won the title at Bolton. So this day was an accumulation of many years of underachievement, lots of toil, but no triumph, I suppose you could say. And even more so, if you put it into context, even 2 years prior to this, the club almost went into liquidation as well. There was never any money at Bradford. So to have this now, this tangible feeling of success, well, everyone wanted to be there. One of those supporters who was there that day was Derek Dempsey, and we've spoken to his daughter, Georgie, and his wife, Glenys, as well.
He was really excited. He was really giddy. He was like a kid. When it was time for him to go, He came and gave my mum a proper kiss. And I'm like, oh, parent, you know, that kind of thing.
When he was going and he got to the back door and he turned round and he just said to me, "Don't start cooking at your normal time," he said, "because I might be delayed getting home. Because there'll be a lot of people at this game." But he never came home at all.
I mean, it's heartbreaking listening to them talk about their dad and their husband, but also when the daughter first starts chatting, it's really lovely. It makes you smile straight away because you can almost picture the dad. You can picture Derek about to go out, can't you? All jolly, so excited, and then just that thought, you know, G just never came home. Chris, when did the fire start? When did things start to go terribly wrong?
Yeah, well, Lucy, the game itself was a complete non-event. It was a dead rubber. Bradford City have already been promoted. They'd already been presented with the Division 3 trophy at the start of the game. That's quite prophetic, really, that they were presented with a trophy before the match. That never usually happens. It usually happens after a game. So, you know, fate would have it that they actually got to celebrate something before the disaster happened. But yeah, the game, a nothing game. Nothing actually happened. It was a boring football match until around the 42nd, 43rd minute, and the camera sweeps across, the Yorkshire Television camera sweeps across the main stand to the right-hand side. There's a little flicker in the corner, and then John Helm, who was the commentator for Yorkshire TV back in 1985, he mentions the fact that there's a fire started in the stand.
And we are going to hear a bit of that commentary now because it was on ITV. On the first bit of it, you hear him kind of notice the flames, and then there's a gap, and then, you know, the second bit that we'll hear is as it's developed a short time later.
And we've actually got a fire in the stand on the far side of the ground, and that looks very nasty indeed. Now the police have gone over there to try and quell the fire, and they're frantically getting some of the supporters out. And the 2,500 people in that stand are panicking. They are frantic to get out. And these are disastrous scenes for the club. One can feel the heat. And that is a catastrophic sight for Bradford City Football Club.
I mean, for those who can't see the video, and for our listeners, what strikes you so much is the speed at which those, you know, the flames, the small fire develops into a huge inferno. Was it something like 4 minutes or something that it really took off?
Yeah, that's right, Lucy. Yeah, 4.5 minutes it took from that first John Helm noticing the fire in the stand to the whole stand ablaze. Really quite frightening, really, isn't it? And it's the visceral images of that fire as well that really capture you. And John Helm's commentary as well. You know, we spoke to a few people for our programme who said that people can lose their careers commentating on something like that, but John gets the tone just right, you know.
Yeah, because when he first notices the flames, there isn't drama in his voice at all. He just says, you know, there's a fire that's broken out. But then he maintains calm, but you can tell in his voice that he was no longer calm, but he gave such authority, but not in a panic.
Yeah, that's right. John's a Bradford man as well, so there were people in that stand that he knew as well at that time. That's where the press box was located. A lot of his friends were in that stand, so can you imagine what it must have been like for him to be staring at that fire at that time and having to continue to work. But yeah, I mean, the speed of the fire spreading was incredible, really, and there was a number of factors behind that, Lucy, as well. You know, there was a wind that day which made this fire spread across the top. There was a flammable material on that stand that in this day and age wouldn't be allowed, but we're talking 1985, health and safety wasn't quite up to the standards as we expect these days. It was a wooden stand as well. We don't get those these days. After Bradford, incidentally, I'm sure we'll get onto that in a second, underneath that stand, litter had accumulated there over many years. I think we've got some pictures of a newspaper clipping from 1968 that had caught fire. That's how old some of the rubbish was that had accumulated in that void under the stand. And so when it took
Is
hold,
that what happened, Chris? Was
spread.
it something specific that set it off, or what was the cause? Was that ever found out?
I mean, Definitively, I don't think we can say what caused it, but it was widely accepted that it was a discarded match or cigarette that had been dropped beneath the stand, and that had ignited that rubbish under the stand. And then, as we know, it took hold, and that's what caused the fire. That's the widely accepted cause of the Bradford City Stadium fire.
Now, among some of the many people you have spoken for this series of programmes, you know, people did survive this. I've seen some footage of people scrambling across the front. I think there were only two ways to get out, one over the front onto the pitch and then turnstiles at the back.
Yeah, that's right. As you say, Lucy, the people escaped onto the pitch. I mean, one firefighter we spoke to said that, you know, psychologically, you don't run onto a football pitch. Yeah. You're always told never to run onto a football pitch. So tragically, some people went to the back of the stand where the gates were locked, the turnstiles were locked, whereas a lot of people who escaped, everyone who escaped at the front of the stand. And you know what, someone told us as well, had the Heysel disaster, which I'm sure you'll be familiar with as well, Lucy, coming from the northwest, where 39 fans died in a European Cup final between Liverpool and Juventus. That only happened 2 weeks after Bradford. And the result of that was barriers being placed in front of stands to cage football fans in. Tragically, as we know, at Hillsborough.
Hillsborough the same.
And a police officer told us, who was at Valley Parade that day in 1985, he says if there was a metal cage in front of that stand, there'd have been 2,056 people dead rather than 56, because they'd have had nowhere to go. That had been caged within that stand. But yeah, we've been speaking to survivors who miraculously made it out. One of them, a 17-year-old man at the time called Matthew Wildman, who suffered with severe arthritis. It was his first season watching Bradford City. Big season, a celebration for him, but never did he realise that it had ended such tragic circumstances. But he walked with crutches. So there's so many stories of heroism, of players helping, firefighters helping, police helping, everyone helping people escape that burning stand. But Matthews is probably the most miraculous escape. He was the last person to survive out of that burning stand.
I looked down and found that the wall that I was stood in front of, all the paint was bubbling up. And then, as I had my hands on the wall, I realised that all the skin on the backs of my hands were bubbling up as well. So it was a case of do something now or never. I shouted out and threw myself over the wall. Thankfully, there was a person called David Hustler. He heard my screams. He then scrambled us to the outer wall and over and out, and we were the last to get out.
Before we came and pressed record, basically, on our chat, you said to me that this seems and often termed the forgotten disaster. And we mentioned Hillsborough at the beginning of our chat. That happened 36 years ago. Only 4 years after Bradford, 97 died at Hillsborough, 56 died at Bradford, 265 injured. Why do you think it's not talked about anywhere near as much as Hillsborough?
I think it's just because that people don't want to talk about it. There was no blame apportioned really at the time, whereas Hillsborough and Heysel, there was blame apportioned. Obviously, many years later for Hillsborough, that came to fruition quite rightly. But in Bradford, no, it was just seen as a tragic accident at the time. And 10 years ago, there was a book released where there were accusations that there was, it might not have been the tragic accident many people assumed that it was. There was fingers pointed at certain hierarchy within the Bradford City organisation at the time, but nothing has ever been proved. There was an inquiry and an inquest held not long after Bradford as well, when it was determined that it was an accident. The inquest, it was a ruling of misadventure, that the club and the council could have done more to prevent this, in as much they could have cleared the rubbish under the stand, they could have improved the ground, they could have spent money wisely on improving the facilities at Bradford.
I mean, it changed so many lives up in Yorkshire. How do you think that fire also then changed football? Do you think it did?
I think it did to a certain extent, but probably not as much as it should have done. The inquiry, which was led by Oliver Popplewell in 1985 following the disaster, ruled that wooden stands were outlawed. They were never allowed to be built again. Smoking was banned in wooden stands as well. There was better policing, better stewarding. So the authorities were looking at what happened at Bradford and responding accordingly to ensure, hopefully to ensure that this sort of thing never happened again. But as we saw, as I mentioned earlier with Heysel 2 weeks later, their response to Heysel was to put up metal barriers and cage football fans within stadiums. And look what happened at Hillsborough 4 years later. 97 people died, crushed up against barriers that had been placed there because of a previous disaster. So it was almost like kicking the can down the road. Stadia back then weren't up to the standards required, and maybe the government, the authorities, weren't looking at these disasters and thinking about the human cost of what happened at Valley Parade, at Heysel, at Hillsborough. They were thinking about the problems that football fans caused inside stadiums back then. They weren't thinking about the dangers that football fans were having to endure every time they went to watch their team play, that they were watching matches in stadiums that weren't fit for purpose, that were dangerous. So I don't think Bradford had that big an impact. Well, it can't have done, can it? Because Hillsborough happened 4 years later.
Yeah. Chris, why, can I just ask you, just to kind of close things off, why did you want to do such an in-depth, solid body of work on what happened 40 years ago?
Well, I think it was right to do it. There have been documentaries on Bradford, fantastic documentaries on the Bradford City fire. We've got the pictures here in-house. We know exactly what happened. It's local to me. I'm from the area. It matters to people in the area, as we've discussed before, and I think it's right to. I mean, people will tell you that they will remember Bradford. It doesn't matter if there's a 0 on the end of the anniversary. Every year they will remember what happened that day at Valley Parade. You know, it's not easy, is it, to tell your life story and what happened to you if something tragic happened. But thankfully, they've trusted us to tell their story, and I hope we've done them justice as well.
I'm quite sure you will have, Chris. Thank you so much for chatting to me.
Thank you.
Well, you can watch Chris's special. It's the series and it's called Never Forget, the Bradford City Stadium Fire on ITVX. And remember, you can subscribe to What You Need to Know wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. So until next time, thanks for joining us.